and information. The 1960s was a real interesting decade, and we've talked about some of this with the counterculture movement, but we're going to cover many different areas as your sheet says. We're going to talk about 7 contributing factors to violence in the 60s, probably our most violent decade in our history. We're going to talk about the drug culture of the United States, which includes the music industry as well. We're going to talk about fashions in the 1960s. We're going to talk about some popular movies in the 60s. Then we're going to give you some good information on Marilyn Monroe, which I think you'll enjoy. So that's kind of what this is going to cover. And we should be through this by the end of next week with the block schedule possibly, and have an exam early the week after that. So what I'm going to do right off the bat is give you 7 contributing factors to violence in the 1960s. Now you should be able to come up with a couple of them without me telling. Okay, what would be something that's happened that I've talked to you about in the 1960s that contributed to violence in the decade? Civil rights, very good. Civil rights, no question. You've had violent coverage of civil rights. You've had problems in Selma. You've had problems in Montgomery. You've had problems in Chicago. We've talked about all kinds of different problems. Mississippi with James Meredith. And so one of the 7 contributing factors to violence in the 1960s was the civil rights movement. And an example of that would be simply violence and coverage of those different civil rights protests and riots across the country, like Selma, like Montgomery, like Chicago, like Mississippi. So there's your first contributing factor to violence in the 1960s, the civil rights movement. What's another one we've talked about that's been incredibly well publicized and violent during the 60s? We didn't finish it yet. We haven't finished. Vietnam War. Very good. So there's another contributing factor to violence in the 1960s. It's the Vietnam War. How does that show violence? Every night, news coverage about the war. Every night, news coverage about the war. What else do they have news coverage about concerning the Vietnam War in the 60s that would be considered violent? The protests. Very good. The protests to that war. Need to get a picture?
Yeah, I need a picture of your whole class.
Okay, well let's all get up here and crowd in like we've done before and get a picture. We're missing some. Actually, yeah, we're missing 4, but anyway, get right up there. Olivia will snap a great photo.
Just like
Here we've done this before, kids. So let's roll here.
okay, you're breathing. Oh my god. Oh, where's the little button? Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, there we go. Okay. You guys are good.
Hi, Miss Jolly, you have a visitor here. And then, okay, yeah, we'll get back at it. So the Vietnam War is another violent issue in the 1960s. So you got nightly news coverage and you got news coverage of the protests. Another thing, as an example, is it was kind of sad, but every night they'd give you new body counts in Vietnam. Okay, 37 kids, there's 37 soldiers killed in Vietnam today. 3 from this area, 7 from this area. That happened every night, nightly body counts on the news. So the second contributing factor to violence in the 60s was the Vietnam War. Some examples of nightly news coverage of the Vietnam War, nightly news coverage of the protests against the Vietnam War, and the nightly news coverage and announcement of the body counts reported back of those killed in Vietnam daily. Okay, let's see if there's another one. There's another one, something we've talked about that you should get that was very violent. There's been 4 of them in the 60s. Political assassinations, very good. Political assassinations. Obviously, in 1963, we had the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and shortly afterwards, the assassination of his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. So you had the assassination of President Kennedy and the assassination of his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Another assassination in chronological order would be what? Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. So political assassinations were another contributing factor to violence in the 1960s. Now, does anybody want to think, can anybody think outside the box of what might be another one? We really haven't talked about it yet, but we're going to in detail. What's another contributing factor?
Was it Boston, the sheriff was?
Well, not,
Charles Manson?
yeah, well, that, yeah, we haven't got that. That's a good one. That won't be in this part. That's a good one. But that happened in '69. We'll talk about that. Anything else you think might have showed a violent edge to them in the 1960s? You kind of, I think it's obvious that it ruined lives, that some of you knew today. What culture? But what inside that? The drug culture. Okay, drug culture. The drug culture. I don't have any specific examples of the drug culture, but I mean the drug culture in general, which we're going to be talking about here pretty soon, was a contributing factor to violence in the 1960s. Not a lot of good came out of that among people. Another one we kind of talked about with ratings was movies. Another contributing factor to violence in the 60s were movies. Because in that decade, movies we talked about became more, showed more nudity, but it also became more violent. You had your Bonnie and Clyde movies, and you had more gore in the movies, so to speak, explicit gore, than you had in decades prior to that. Now, we're kind of not, you know, that doesn't even focus you guys. I mean, I think of Saving Private Ryan. Has anybody seen that movie?
Yeah.
I mean, if you saw that in the theater, it was unbelievable. The realistic, you know, viewpoint of someone being shot in the head or shot in the chest or whatever. Prior to that, movies weren't like that. You didn't see it. You could watch the old Gunsmokes and the old westerns like Bonanza. Do you see blood splurting out? I mean, so that was a change. So movies and the violence that movies created in the 60s contributed to the violence in the 60s overall. Another factor to violence in the 60s were music groups. Because music groups contain two violent acts. What would be one that we already talked about? Drugs. Many musicians or groups in the 1960s were drug users, and we'll talk about that. Not only did music groups contribute to violence through drugs, but their lyrics became more what? Violent. Okay? Kind of like movies. You didn't have a lot of violent lyrics in music in the decades prior to the 1960s, but you did in the 1960s, and now you don't even, I mean, it isn't even a concern for some of this music that listen to talks about shooting and killing and everything else. So, anyway, so we've got civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, movies, music groups, and political assassinations, and the drug culture. Now here's one that might surprise you. An industry that contributed to violence in the 60s that changed from the 50s. Toys. Toys. And here's the best example I can give you of that. In 1964, Hasbro came out with the G.I. Joe. Okay? And that was a direct reflection to what event? Vietnam. And it became quite an issue because these G.I. Joe dolls were very popular. This just happens to be a replica. I do have an original at home. But this is a replica, and these were just sold like crazy. Okay? And everybody accepted it as a matter of pride when the war started. But later in the war, in 1968, they changed this G.I. Joe from G.I. Joe Action Soldier to G.I. Joe Adventure Hero. And they changed the complete design of it. I have one in my office I'll bring tomorrow. They put a less military look on them. They made their hair fuzzy, more the kind of the afro look to a point, and changed the entire appearance of the G.I. Joe. Okay, Army men were another thing that I remember playing with when I was a kid. They started developing Army men. We were at war in Vietnam, so you know kids were getting their Army men and bang, bang, and boom. What else went with Army men that started being developed that wasn't in the 50s so much? Toy machine guns, those types of things. So toys became more violent. Toys became more violent in the 1960s, and it contributed to violence in the decade. And again, examples are G.I. Joe Action Hero, or excuse me, Soldier, then moving to Action Hero. You had the machine guns, the Army men. You know, kids were playing war more, those types of things that were not maybe as wholesome as you had seen in decades prior. So those are 7 contributing factors to violence in the 1960s. And we're going to use the next subtopic to pinpoint one of those, and that's the drug culture in the United States during the 1960s. And I want to preface this by saying I am not promoting any of you to use drugs, okay? I'm telling you what the drug culture was in the 1960s, and unfortunately, some of this is making a turnaround, and some of this might seem familiar in 2016. But I'm going to give you 5 serious factors that led to the drug culture movement across America in the 1960s. 5 serious factors that led to the drug culture as we know it in the 1960s. 5 serious factors that led to the drug culture in America as we know it during the 1960s. Anybody want to guess what one of the 5 factors is? I won't hold it against you.
Counterculture?
What part of it? You're right. What part of it? What's that?
The festival.
Okay, and what was used at the festivals? What type? Let's talk about marijuana. Okay, marijuana is one serious factor that led to the drug culture in the 1960s. Marijuana. You want me to spell it for you?
Yeah.
Mary Jane. Weed. If anybody wrote weed down already, I'm on you. Okay, marijuana. Juana. Marijuana. Marijuana. Now, anybody want to guess the year that marijuana was first outlawed? What would you guess? What just take some guess. 83?
No, it was like 74.
How about 1937? Marijuana was first, yeah, he's dyslexic. Marijuana was first outlawed in 1937. And it was used by America's youth to get high. You didn't see a lot of adults using marijuana in the 1960s. Now you see a lot of adults probably using marijuana in 2016 that are products of those people in the 1960s. Okay, we'll talk about that. But in the 1960s, marijuana was used a high majority by youth to get high. Now, there were 5 advantages that the youth culture had concerning marijuana. 5 advantages, okay? I'm not saying, you'll get it when I tell you. 5 advantages that America's youth would say about marijuana. And it's probably some of it's probably true today, to be honest with you. Because I know marijuana's bad, right? One advantage was it was cheap. In the 1960s, it was not very expensive. It was cheap to buy. You didn't have to be rich to buy marijuana. Number 2, it was available. There was a lot of it. 3, it was widely accepted among the youth. It was widely accepted among the youth. So those are just general advantages. As far as personal advantages, it broke down inhibitions. Broke down inhibitions. In other words, someone that might be very, very quiet and introverted might smoke a little marijuana and all of a sudden be very extroverted. Okay, people would be more apt to do things maybe or take chances if they were smoking marijuana they wouldn't do if they weren't high, which is not a lot different than alcohol, to be quite frank with you. Okay, everybody gets a shot of loudmouth in it once in a while, you know what I mean? Everybody acts differently. Another thing it did is it would heighten a person's form of perception. It would heighten a person's form of perception. What does that mean? Heighten a person's form of perception. Huh? I'm not holding against you, Taylor. Just telling you things. Make your focus. And if a fly flew over and landed on the top of Mary's head, if I was high on marijuana, I may be able to see every single fiber of that fly's body. Every hair, every wing. Okay? At least you would think you would. So it gave you a better form of perception. Okay? So marijuana. There you go. Everybody's different, right? Okay, the next serious factor that led to the drug culture, I have a hard time pronouncing, but I'll give it a shot. It's on your ID sheet. Lysergic acid dithylamide, or better known as LSD. So we'll just refer to it as LSD, lysergic acid dithylamide, better known and better referred to as LSD. I don't know if this is making a comeback or not. I hear it is, but also known as acid, okay? Now, this, I don't know if you know this or not, but LSD is a chemical, and it was accidentally developed, okay? LSD is a chemical, and it was accidentally developed. It's a chemical and was accidentally developed. And it was accidentally developed by a Swedish scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann. And he did so in 1938. So LSD was a chemical that had been accidentally developed by a Swedish scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann in 1938. What kind of drug is it? Hallucinogenic drug. You want me to spell that for you? Hallucinogenic drug. Hallucinogenic. Hallucinogenic. Hallucinogenic drug. We'll talk about that in a minute. It was colorless, and it was tasteless, and it was odorless. So you didn't have a specific color. It was clear. It was tasteless. You couldn't taste it. And it was odorless. You couldn't smell it. Now, what LSD does is I'll just read this to you right now what you want. It produces marked deviations from normal behavior, from its ability to inhibit the action of serotonin, which is a transmitter of nerve impulses in brain tissue. I'll read it again, get what you want out of it. It certainly won't be on the test. But LSD produces a marked deviation from normal behavior. You don't act like you normally act. And what it does is it inhibits the action of what's called serotonin, for you science or human anatomy people. And serotonin is a transmitter of nerve impulses in your brain. It allows you to function. And what LSD does is it inhibits the action of that serotonin in your brain, which transmits the nerve pulses in brain tissue. So if you took LSD, you would take a hallucinogenic trip of a lifetime. Okay? You take a trip. It's like a really weird dream. It could be a real pleasurable dream, or it could be the most horrible, horrific experience of your life. Everybody reacted to it differently. So when you took LSD, you went on an acid trip. And some people came off these acid trips and felt refreshed, and the trip they took, or the dreams they had, or the hallucinations they were involved in were very pleasurable, made them feel great. Other people, just the opposite. And the second time somebody took LSD, they might get the opposite reaction of what they got the first time. And the most common way to take LSD at the time was an eyedropper and drop it into a sugar cube and then eat the sugar cube. Although they had little papers, perforated papers like this, that looked like a checkerboard, and you just put a drop on each one, and they would tear them apart, and they'd put them under their tongue or on their, in their tongue or whatever. So that's how it was done. But anyway, you know how Hoffman discovered that he made this LSD? What's that? He tried it, and he went on his first LSD trip. And he didn't try it purposely. What happened on April 16th, 1943, is while he was working with this substance, it absorbed through his skin. And that's when he went on his first trip. Okay? So Hoffman studied the drug after he discovered it. On April 16th, 1943, he accidentally absorbed the drug into his skin. April 16th, 1943, he absorbed it into his skin. And when he was driving home that evening, he started feeling really weird. Okay? So he went directly to bed when he got home and thought he had the flu. Okay? And the following Monday, he took another dose purposely because during that first trip he had, he felt what he stated as reborn. So he must have had a good trip, okay? So it accidentally absorbed into his skin. He went home, went to bed, thought he had the flu, and had this wonderful hallucination, okay? He thought he was reborn. So he tried it again. And he, after trying it a couple of times, referred to his discovery as his, quote, problem child. Because he knew that this had effects different ways. Okay? Referred to it as his problem child. How many will not be here tomorrow, just out of curiosity? I think we got a pretty full class, don't we? Good. We'll continue on with some LSD. Verbally. Okay. See you tomorrow. We have to offer some extra credit the way it's done. Okay, girls, we'll see you tomorrow, Friday. Tomorrow's the 7th.
This